They called it the engine that would keep Navistar competitive. Instead, it nearly sank the company. For decades, international trucks were a backbone of the American trucking industry. Their engines had powered everything from long-haul rigs to vocational trucks, trusted by fleets and independents alike. But in the late 2000s, with new emissions regulations looming, International made a gamble, one that truckers would pay for, with breakdowns, downtime, and staggering repair bills. At the center of that gamble was one name: MaxxForce, a line of engines that promised compliance with EPA standards, fuel efficiency, and reliability. Instead, it became a disaster. Today, the MaxxForce stands as a case study in engineering hubris, corporate miscalculation, and the high cost of cutting corners. By the early 2000s, the trucking industry was being dragged into a new era of environmental regulation. The Environmental Protection Agency tightened the noose on nitrogen oxides, particulate matter, and other harmful emissions. Engine makers had no choice but to adapt or risk being regulated out of existence. Most of the heavyweights, Cummins, Detroit Diesel, Volvo, made a pragmatic choice. They leaned into selective catalytic reduction (SCR), an after-treatment technology that relied on diesel exhaust fluid (DEF). Yes, DEF meant truckers had to deal with an extra fluid, but the results were undeniable. It cleaned exhaust gases after combustion. It worked reliably in testing, and it allowed engines to maintain their performance without radical redesigns. SCR was the safe bet, the proven path. International, under Navistar's leadership, scoffed at the idea. Executives branded DEF as a coward solution, dismissing it as a European gimmick that American truckers would never accept. Their marketing department spun horror stories about DEF jugs freezing in truck stops, clogged systems leaving rigs stranded, and fleets drowning in maintenance costs. Instead, Navistar promised salvation through a bold, all-American solution: exhaust gas recirculation. EGR-only engines. EGR itself wasn't revolutionary. It had been around since the 1970s. The idea was simple: recirculate exhaust gases back into the combustion chamber, lowering combustion temperatures and cutting down NOx. But Navistar wasn't content with some EGR. To meet the EPA's brutal 2010 standards without SCR, they doubled down on EGR to levels no other manufacturer dared attempt. Competitors quietly warned it was suicide. Engineers knew the thermodynamics didn't add up to much. EGR meant higher soot levels, more heat stress, clogged filters, and inevitable breakdowns. Even inside Navistar, whispers circulated that the math didn't work. But the executives weren't listening. They had already bet the company's reputation and billions of dollars on their claim that they had cracked the code. This was more than a gamble. It was arrogance at the highest level of corporate decision-making. While the rest of the industry hedged with SCR, Navistar positioned themselves as the mavericks, the disruptors who would save truckers from the hassle of DEF. They mocked competitors for caving in to the EPA. They even launched aggressive ad campaigns portraying themselves as the only manufacturer with the courage to fight back. But there was a problem. The MaxxForce engines built on this technology collapsed. Instead of being the triumph Navistar promised, they became a rolling disaster, the poster child for hubris in American manufacturing. What was marketed as freedom from DEF turned into endless breakdowns, lawsuits, and one of the greatest engineering debacles in trucking history. The decision to go EGR only was a serious blunder. It set the stage for what many drivers and fleet owners now call the single biggest engine failure the industry has ever seen. On paper, Navistar's MaxxForce EGR-only system looked like a stroke of genius. No bulky DEF tanks, no extra hoses or sensors, no foreign chemical to buy, store, or freeze up on a January morning in Minnesota. Everything happened inside the engine itself, neat, self-contained, elegant. That was the sales pitch. Reality was far uglier. To hit the EPA's 2010 standards without SCR, MaxxForce had to recirculate truly massive amounts of exhaust back into the cylinders, far beyond what any other heavy-duty engine dared. What looked like simplicity in a PowerPoint slide turned into one of the most over-engineered, self-destructive designs the trucking world had ever seen. The engineering failures came fast and brutal. Excessive heat, Shoving that much exhaust back inside the chambers sent operating temps through the roof. Engines routinely overheated, blowing head gaskets, warping components, and leaving rigs stranded on the side of the road. Mechanics started joking that MaxxForce was a rolling barbecue pit, clogging and soot. Exhaust packed with particulates went beyond lowering emissions. It choked the engine to death. EGR coolers, valves, and sensors clogged so often that it felt like a built-in maintenance plan. Fleets reported coolers failing in under 20,000 miles, a nightmare frequency for long-haul operators. Some trucks spent more time in the shop than on the road. Turbo stress. To compensate for all that choking exhaust, Navistar leaned on a fragile dual-turbo setup. On paper, it was cutting edge. In practice, those turbos were grenades waiting to explode. Constant exposure to high heat and soot meant turbo failures were common, and when they failed, they often failed big. Poor fuel economy. Navistar had promised truckers a cost advantage by avoiding DEF, but with so much dirty air being cycled through the engine, fuel efficiency cratered. Instead of saving money at the pump, truckers watched their costs climb while still battling constant downtime. And while Navistar was gambling its future on this all-internal miracle cure, competitors had already proven that SCR, though heavier and slightly more expensive up front, worked. It was stable. It was reliable. It kept trucks on the road. The bottom line was that MaxxForce engines failed outright. It was a betrayal of trust, a corporate gamble that sacrificed truckers' livelihoods to prop up an ego-driven engineering philosophy that was doomed from day one. Ask any fleet that runs MaxxForce engines, and the stories sound like a broken record of downtime, frustration, and financial ruin. What Navistar sold as a game-changing engine became, in the real world, a rolling disaster. Owner-operators described loads ruined because their trucks shut down mid-haul. Contracts were lost, customers walked away, and reputations were shredded. For independent drivers, a single breakdown at the wrong time could mean bankruptcy. And with MaxxForce, breakdowns weren't an occasional headache. They were a routine expectation. Fleets that bought in bulk suffered even worse. Companies with dozens or hundreds of trucks suddenly faced maintenance costs spiraling out of control. Shops became overwhelmed with cracked EGR coolers, blown turbos, and sensors that failed so often they might as well have been disposable parts. Some engines couldn't even make it 50,000 miles without a catastrophic failure, an unthinkable figure in an industry where competitors routinely delivered 500,000 miles before a major rebuild. Drivers joked that MaxxForce-powered rigs didn't belong on the highway. They belonged on a tow hook. The nickname Breakdown Force circulated in truck stops and online forums, a brutal but fitting epitaph for Navistar's failed gamble. Fleets started calling their trucks shop queens because they spent more time parked in service bays than earning money on the road. And in trucking, reliability is probably the most vital bit. Every hour a rig sits dead on the shoulder means missed deadlines, missed paychecks, and stranded drivers waiting for tow trucks. For many who invested in Navistar's promises, buying a MaxxForce-powered truck felt like a catastrophic mistake. It felt like the worst decision of their careers. The damage went beyond engines. It wrecked livelihoods. Trust in Navistar collapsed almost overnight, and once word spread, the brand's reputation in the trucking world was torched beyond recognition. Diesel history isn't spotless. Plenty of engines have flopped. Caterpillar's ACERT system, for instance, frustrated fleets so badly that it pushed many lifelong Cat loyalists into the arms of Cummins. Even Detroit's legendary 60 Series, once considered bulletproof, stumbled in its later emissions-era trims. But here's the difference. Those engines, for all their headaches, still had a path forward. They could be tweaked, improved, or rebuilt. Customers were angry, but they weren't abandoned. MaxxForce was something else entirely. Navistar went beyond producing a bad engine. They created a disaster. They built an entire corporate identity around a flawed idea, then doubled down when everyone else proved them wrong. While every other manufacturer after 2010 embraced SCR and DEF as the only reliable way to meet emissions, Navistar stood alone, planting their flag in the sand with EGR only. Inside Navistar, engineers raised red flags. Regulators warned it wouldn't work. Competitors flat out laughed, calling it impossible. But Navistar's leadership ignored them all. They gambled that truckers would hate DEF so much they'd embrace whatever alternative Navistar pushed. They claimed to be solving a problem, but in reality they were selling a fantasy. The cost of that arrogance was staggering. Navistar poured billions into trying to brute force physics with more EGR flow, bigger coolers, and increasingly complex turbo setups. The result was exactly what critics predicted: cracked EGR coolers, blown head gaskets, sensors drowning in soot, and turbos failing under impossible conditions. Fleets experienced far more than occasional hiccups. Their trucks became permanently chained to service bays. And instead of cutting losses and admitting defeat, Navistar doubled down again. They kept telling customers the breakthrough was just around the corner. They even chose to pay hundreds of millions in EPA non-compliance fines rather than adopt SCR like everyone else. By the time they finally gave up, years had been wasted, billions were gone, and the damage to their reputation was irreversible. Meanwhile, fleets that had gone with Cummins 1SX, Detroit DD Series, or Volvo power plants kept rolling. Sure, SCR had its quirks, but those engines stayed on the road. They earned money instead of hemorrhaging it. By 2012, the message was loud and clear across the trucking world. If uptime mattered, you avoided MaxxForce like the plague. That's the key difference. Caterpillar's ACERT was a misstep. Detroit's late emissions tweaks were growing pains. But MaxxForce was more than a flawed engine. It was a complete collapse, a self-inflicted corporate implosion that went beyond sinking a product line. It torched the credibility of one of America's most iconic truck brands and left thousands of truckers holding the bag. MaxxForce went beyond failure. It became a cautionary tale, the textbook case of what happens when arrogance drives engineering. Truckers have long memories and they don't forgive betrayal. Once the horror stories of MaxxForce downtime spread, International's sales nosedived. Fleets that had bought International for decades jumped ship to Freightliner, Kenworth, and Peterbilt. Owner-operators who once swore by the brand refused to even look at a truck with a MaxxForce badge under the hood. The resale market was even uglier. Used truck values for MaxxForce-powered rigs collapsed to the point of absurdity. Dealers couldn't move them, even at bargain bin prices. Some fleets ended up practically giving trucks away just to cut their losses. For many, a MaxxForce engine wasn't an asset, it was a liability chained to the balance sheet. And then came the lawsuits. Fleets across the country accused Navistar of knowingly selling defective engines. In court, ugly truths spilled out. Internal documents revealed that even Navistar's own engineers doubted EGR only could meet 2010 standards reliably. Emails and reports showed executives pushing ahead anyway, more concerned with saving face and market share than with keeping their customers on the road. Judges and juries didn't buy Navistar's excuses. Settlements and verdicts piled up, draining the company of hundreds of millions of dollars. Navistar lost more than money. They lost something far more valuable: credibility. For decades, International had been a trusted name in trucking. But after MaxxForce, that trust was shattered. Customers felt deceived, mechanics felt abandoned, and drivers felt like guinea pigs in a failed experiment. Even years later, the stain hasn't fully faded. Mention MaxxForce in a truck stop today, and you'll still hear curses, bitter laughs, and horror stories. Navistar bet everything on a bad idea, and in doing so, they destroyed far more than engines. They broke faith with the very people who kept their brand alive. And in trucking, once trust collapses, it's almost impossible to rebuild. Today, MaxxForce is remembered not merely as a bad engine, but as a disaster, one of the greatest engineering failures the trucking industry has ever seen. Not because it lacked horsepower, not because it was cheaply built, but it was built on a fundamentally broken idea, sold with arrogance, and forced onto customers who became unwilling test subjects in a billion-dollar experiment. Its legacy can be summed up in 4 brutal truths. Navistar thought they could beat the system, outsmart their competitors, outmaneuver the EPA, and even bend the laws of thermodynamics with enough brute force. They couldn't. Betting against proven SCR technology was more than a gamble, it was corporate suicide. To this day, business schools and industry analysts cite MaxxForce as a textbook example of how hubris can destroy an entire product line. For decades, International was one of the most trusted names in American trucking. Generations of fleets ran Internationals without hesitation. MaxxForce destroyed that loyalty overnight. Longtime customers walked away, some vowing never to return. In an industry where uptime is everything, International's name became synonymous with downtime. And once trust evaporates in trucking, it doesn't come back. The fallout was staggering. Navistar bled billions through warranty claims, class action lawsuits, tanking resale values, and collapsing sales. Fleets that had been burned either sued or cut their losses. The financial crater was so deep that Navistar couldn't climb out alone. It limped along until it was eventually absorbed into Volkswagen's Traton Group. In hindsight, MaxxForce went beyond crippling an engine program. It crippled the company itself. More than a decade later, the stigma still lingers. Used truck buyers still ask the same question before they even pop the hood. Does it have a MaxxForce in it? If the answer is yes, the deal is dead on arrival. That's how toxic the name has become. No other engine failure has left such a permanent black mark on resale markets and customer perception. When industry veterans trade stories about failed engines, plenty of names get tossed around. Caterpillar Acert, Detroit's late-emission 60 series, even some early SCR models. But MaxxForce, it enters the conversation and completely dominates it. It proved to be not merely unreliable, it was catastrophic. It was far more than a misstep. It became an anchor that dragged one of America's most iconic truck brands straight to the bottom. The MaxxForce legacy is simple: arrogance, denial, and betrayal. And it will remain a permanent warning to every engineer and executive who thinks they can sell dreams instead of working engines. The MaxxForce story is about more than broken engines. It is a lesson in how arrogance and miscalculation can ruin even a legendary brand. Navistar thought they knew better than the rest of the industry. They ignored the warnings, pushed out engines that couldn't survive real-world conditions, and left truckers holding the bill. The result? The MaxxForce has earned its title as the worst diesel engine ever put into production. Not because it was underpowered, not because it was weak, but because it failed at the one thing truckers demand, above all else: reliability. Today, when a mechanic hears about MaxxForce, they don't think of innovation. They think of endless repairs, red-hot temp gauges, and a reminder that in trucking, you don't gamble with engines. That's why the MaxxForce will forever be remembered as the biggest engine failure in trucking history.